Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Live at Lunch. My name is Kim Goff. I'm a learning program developer here at the Royal BC Museum, and I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, the Lekwungen people, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live and work in this area. I want to welcome you all back to Live at Lunch. This is a free noon hour series, typically on the first Wednesday of the month. I do want to note that next month, our presentation will be on March the 8th. It's the second Wednesday of the month, and I'll tell you more about that at the end of our presentation. Presentations are approximately 1 hour in length, and we include some time at the end for a Q&A. Today, we have a panel of 3 presenters for you, and they're here to talk about deep time and tell us what it means about our changing climate. Dr. Gavin Hanke, curator of vertebrates, will be our first up, and much of his published work is based on his PhD thesis on the fossil fish from the Lower Devonian. Dr. Victoria Arbour will speak second. She is a vertebrate paleontologist and an evolutionary biologist. And Dr. Henry Choong will be our last speaker, and among his many research projects, he's part of a collaborative group of scientists studying the transoceanic dispersal following the catastrophic earthquake in Japan of 2011. So the tsunami debris and that moves around. So now we've done our introductions. I want you to buckle up, get ready to go back, way back into deep time. And let's start in the Devonian period with Dr. Gavin Hanke.
Okay. Hey, that worked. Okay, so if you go back 400 million years, don't expect the world to look the same. It was radically different here because here it was basically water, back in the Devonian period. And this was the age of fishes. So of course it's near and dear to my heart. Best time the world has ever known. So where was BC back then? So you can see the moth localities where where the fish I studied came from. That was a little bit above the equator. BC was just a little bit south of there. So we weren't far off the equator. Currents were complex in the area. It could have actually been a cooler current passing us by, but definitely it was not the kind of environment that you'd expect today. Russia or Siberia, North America and Europe were sort of scrunched up together. So the continents were definitely not in a position that you'd recognize for today. And of course, Gondwana down to the south. But we were basically on the western margin of a continent, and the land that will become BC was still underwater and elsewhere. The moth locality actually is not in British Columbia. I should be specific. It's in the Northwest Territories, just north of Nahanni Park. It's now, the locality is now well up on a mountain, sort of at the part where, as you're climbing a mountain, where the green goes gray. So just above any of the vegetation, and basically you're climbing, we camped on the edge of a cirque, and then we climbed another 300 meters up to get to where the fish deposit is. The deposit's really cool in that there's alternating layers of very fine-grained sediment and then really coarse sediment that has tumbled down slope. So you get material that has died and sunk, and then other stuff that's washed down slope. And so you get these alternating layers that'll give you a little variation in what was in the area. So each of those layers will show you different things. I mean, the ocean, if you look at that, if you're not really into diving and marine biology, you'd say, well, that kind of looks like what we have today. But there are sea lilies, crinoids, there are trilobites. You certainly don't have those today. There's corals, there's sponges, there's marine algae. So it kind of looks similar, but the species that are there are radically different. Now, the moth locality is amazing because the layers where fish and invertebrates died and settled are among the best preserved specimens in the world. This rock we've nicknamed the Wonder Block, and there's 9 species on it. Does the laser work? Yeah, excellent. So These are fishes called acanthodians. So is this little guy, I forgot about that one. This is an osteostracon, or the cephalaspid. Technically, according to modern wisdom, is the closest group of jawless fishes to us. There's two fish here. They're thelodonts, and I've actually got a replica here of one of those. There's a bit of a show and tell at the end. You can have a look at the specimens, get an idea of how big they are. All of the replicas are life size. All of these little black flecks are parts of crustaceans that have settled as well. There are ostracods on this rock. So it's a snapshot in time of things that died, settled, and they seem to have been covered up quickly enough that there's no scavenging, or maybe they settled in an area where there wasn't enough oxygen to support a lot of life and there weren't many scavengers. But the sad part about this is we have not figured out exactly which layer this is. Because if that rock has 9 species, imagine if we could excavate more, and it'd be amazing to see what we could find. Now, my favorite fish on this rock is this one. Not only is it now recognized as one of the earliest basal chondrichthyans, so early shark-like fish, if you will. It has no teeth, by the way, which is weird for a shark, but its gut has remains of one of these. So we know it's a predator, and you can actually tell the species based on the bony remains in the shark's stomach. Very cool rock. I mean, I don't have a replica of this one myself, otherwise I would have brought it today, but absolutely fabulous to see the details. Brachiopods are abundant in the area. They superficially look like a clam, but they're 90 degrees off a clam. Clams close up sideways, brachiopods are more top bottom. You find the occasional conulariid, and to be honest, I'm not an invertebrate zoologist, so Henry, you can enlighten us. I see replicas of these standing on stalks. Sometimes you'll see them, someone's done a replica, they're floating almost like a squid. I've seen them drawn, buried into sediment. Very odd, enigmatic things. The ones at the moth locality are tiny, and unlike anything you'll have today. There's a lot of crinoids, and generally what you find are these little discs, the elements that the actual sea lily is made of. These things are super abundant. The crinoid bits are super abundant in the layers that have tumbled down slope. So they were further offshore or inshore and shallower. So you get this combination of things that have fallen down and things that have just settled slowly as they died and preserved in place. We do get the occasional eurypterid. And now if you look at eurypterids or sea scorpions, you see them online, you'll see pictures of these mega eurypterids, and they make them look horrific and dangerous. I have to say the ones at Moth are about that big. We get a few of them, not too many, and they're super cute. On the wonder block, all those little black flecks are filocarid crustaceans. So you find pieces of the tail, the telson, you find chunks of them, but we've never found a really nice intact one. But I have to say, we have a telson that's about that big. So that was massive. And we've only got one so far of that size. So the invertebrates are just as abundant and just as interesting as the fishes. Some of the rocks are absolutely peppered with ostracods, and they look like little swimming microscopic clams, if you will. And there are rocks in the fish layers. You can't see rock for the ostracod shells covering them. So they were super abundant at times in the plankton. And we get the occasional trilobite fragment. We don't get many at Moth, but they were in the area at the time. So basically 400 million years ago, you're looking at a radically different assemblage in the ocean. And of course, I have to talk about fish. On the table, I've got a replica that I painted up, fancifully painted up, of one of these guys, a fork-tailed thelodont. These fish were first discovered at the Moth locality, and they are unlike any other thelodont group. They're basically like if you took a tadpole, you gave it a fork tail and you squished it laterally, that's what you'd have. Very large eye, gills are here. Some of them have impressions of their gut, which is really cool because you don't often get the internal anatomy preserved so well. And then as their namesake is their fork-shaped tail. Very fascinating. This fossil, when it was found, we actually joked that if you add water, it probably would swim away. It's amazingly preserved. Generally, they're not anywhere nearly as nicely preserved as this one. I don't have a fossil of the next group, the pteraspids. This is a jawless fish. Very odd, pointy rostrum, heavy head shield, scales on the tail, and then, or on the abdomen. Then the tail, the lower lobe is the prominent lobe, unlike sharks where the upper lobe is prominent. So odd little jawless fish. We get a lot of fragments. I've never seen one with body scales, but definitely ones, the head shields are pretty well preserved. These are all stored at the University of Alberta. We don't have any here. There's a lot of this specific type of jawless fish. They're called heterostracans. I don't know if there's a common name for it. Now, I brought a replica here, and it's a replica of this fish. I'm kind of fudging it a bit. This one is actually from the Silurian period, a little earlier. The replica I've got is life-size, by the way. So it's a tiny little fish. But heterostracans, scaled abdomen, tail, large head shield, and the head shields kind of look like a thumbprint. So if you see that in the rocks, very fine ridges on the shield that kind of look like your thumb. And plates on the side, eye, mouth here. These are jawless vertebrates, and there's lots of them. Some of them get quite large. There's one called Lepidaspis. I think it's Lepidaspis. It's probably about that big. So they're not all tiny like little lamprey. And then the osteostracans, our nearest relative in the jawless fishes. The moth locality has beautiful specimens. They're laid out nice and flat. You can even see the gut in some of them. They're amazing, but again, completely unlike anything you've got today. There's probably 7 types of fish related to sharks at the time at the moth locality. So they probably extended along our coast too. And what's weird about them is they've got spines on pretty much every fin. And my colleagues always said that sharks would never have pectoral, pelvic, or anal fin spines, but then they saw this fish and they've had to change their opinion. So lots of early relatives of sharks. The biggest one's probably about that big, and then others much smaller. And again, none of the sharks that we had, actually, no, I lie. Only one of them actually had teeth that we know of. There's also acanthodians. These are historically called spiny sharks. Again, unlike anything you've got today, probably today's best analog would be a stickleback, armored bodies, spines all over the place. But these acanthodians have spines on their belly, the anal fin, pelvic fins, dorsal fins, and there were tons of acanthodians in this fauna, lots of different types. I've brought one, it's neither of those actually. So lots of different types, again, way different than you'd have here today. The other cool fish, and this is where I cut my teeth in paleontology on placoderms back in Manitoba. At the moth locality, there's a fish, all we get are the head shields. This group of fish, it's called a placoderm. The genus that's in the fauna up north there is called Romandina. And they're about the size of most of them are about the size of your thumbnail. So not a big fish. We do have one that's about that big, so a little larger. But they're certainly rare in the moth fauna and basically along this part of the continent. Most people know placoderms. This is a shell-like toy that you can buy. I still don't have one, which is kind of funny, but most people know placoderms based on Dunkleosteus, which is a very large one that many museums display because it's huge. It's about that big across the head, several meters long, big mega predator. So these were the first real experiment in large predators in the Devonian. But on land, I mean, we're underwater here, but if you do find land in the lower Devonian, it's not going to be looking like you'd know today. The plants may be a meter tall. There are fungi that grow these towers. And so, yeah, you won't have flowering plants. You won't have towering pines. It's radically different. All the plants are small. And then on land as well, you don't have amphibians. There would be no birds. There'd be no mammals, no reptiles. It's all arthropods on land as far as the animals are concerned. And the fossil record is sparse in places. It's better in others. But yeah, there's still groups that you could see today. You would recognize them for what they are. So 400 million years ago, radical difference in what we had in North America. Yeah. All right, where's yours? Okay. Oop. Stupid me, I hit save. Close.
All right. Thanks, Gavin. Load it up here. Take my mask off just for talking. Okay, thanks everyone for coming out today. So since part of our theme is on climate change and deep time, I wanted to talk about two examples where the climate has changed really quickly in the fossil record and how we use like museum collections and especially fossils from BC to help answer some of those questions. So we're going to talk about a really cold period in Earth history and a really hot period in Earth history. So climate has changed a lot over the evolution of life on Earth and over sort of geologic timescales. So in addition to human-induced climate change, there is natural climate change that comes about because of things like long periods of volcanism, just the way the Earth wobbles on its orbit. So Earth actually kind of wobbles and wiggles as it goes around the sun on very long time periods. The organization of the continents across the planet can influence things like ocean currents, and that can influence climate change. So there are these kind of natural drivers of climate change over long time periods. And so as you can see, we've had some really hot periods of Earth history, some really cool periods. Sometimes the climate changes slowly, and sometimes it changes really abruptly. And so those are the ones I wanted to focus on today. We've got two examples, a particularly cold snap immediately following the extinction of the dinosaurs about 66 million years ago, and then one about 10 million years later, which is actually one of the hottest periods in Earth history during the age of mammals. So let's start with dinosaurs because that's who I like. So my main area of research is on dinosaurs, especially dinosaurs from the Cretaceous period, or the last of the kind of three geological eras when dinosaurs are around. And I'm particularly interested in them because we don't have a lot from British Columbia yet. So part of what I do is I go out and I look for dinosaur fossils up in the northern part of the province. So I work in an area in northern BC called the Sustut Basin. That's kind of a geological feature in north central BC. The closest towns are kind of Smithers at the bottom end and then Dease Lake up at the top edge. And so this is a pretty cool area to get to go explore. We have a few fragmentary records of dinosaurs from here, but it basically involves me going out and kind of exploring around these high alpine plateaus and looking for bones in all of these boulders. So this is still really new research. So we're still kind of trying to figure out what dinosaurs we have. But what's really cool is that the dinosaurs that lived up in this area of British Columbia probably lived within the last 2 million years before the mass extinction that causes the end of all of the non-bird dinosaurs. So one of the questions that paleontologists like to ask is, were dinosaur communities doing really well up until this mass extinction event, or was there kind of a long, slow decline leading in this mass extinction? So some of the work we do here might help sort of inform some of those questions and answers in the future. So first we have to find the dinosaurs and figure out what they are, and then we can answer some of those bigger questions. But the reason that this particular time period is interesting is because the end of the age of dinosaurs does not end with a whimper, but with a extremely large bang in the form of an asteroid that hits the Earth 66 million years ago. So there's really good evidence in the geological record for this impact event. There is a huge subsurface crater in the Yucatan Peninsula. If anyone here has ever gone to like Cancun and you've gone out sightseeing and to see some of these like cenotes, these big caverns, those are actually found mostly in the ring of the impact crater. So that's kind of a cool like dinosaur feature down in Mexico. And we also have a global layer of volcanic, ash that basically has sort of the remnants of the asteroid in it. So it has an elevated level of a mineral called, or an element called iridium that's mostly found in the asteroids. So we actually have this really great record of this event. And so an asteroid the size of Mount Everest hitting planet Earth is bad. It's not a good day when that happens. So some of the things that happen immediately after the impact, like in the hours and sort of 24 hours afterwards, are we get just colossal shock waves. There are mega tsunamis that actually wash into North America as far as the Dakotas. There's global wildfires basically caused by all of the impact ejecta re-entering the atmosphere as like molten lava. And then probably the most damaging thing is something called an atmospheric heat pulse. And so when you toss a bunch of dust and dirt up into the high atmosphere and it comes back in as basically shooting stars, the friction of that heats up the air. So the air of the entire planet basically heated up to like oven temperatures. And so it's not good to be on the surface of the planet when it's as hot as an oven. So actually most animals probably died within the first day after this impact if they couldn't burrow or hide from that heat pulse. So this is an extremely severe selective pressure in terms of evolution. Like you can't evolve your way out of an atmospheric heat pulse. There's just like nothing you can do about that. You're just going to die, basically. So there's this very severe, very short, like blip, geologically instantaneous erasing of life on the planet, which is really scary. But what happens afterwards is also pretty severe. So a lot of that impact ejecta comes back down into the planet for the next like day or so, creates that really hot environment and the forest fires. But then there's a lot of really fine particles, really, really fine dust that goes up into the stratosphere and basically encircles the planet and dims the sun. So basically a very, very high cloud layer. And this is what we call an impact winter. If anyone was sort of alive in like the Soviet era, this would also be akin to a nuclear winter. And so in the sort of days and months and years following the impact, the surface of the planet cools and we get a very extended winter. And so there's different ideas about how severe and extended this cold period was. But depending on the modeling, the sort of computer simulations that get run, we're looking at global cooling of 25 to 30 degrees very, very quickly, which is a lot. And that lasted at least 3 years, but may have lasted for centuries. So if you can imagine a winter that lasts for centuries over the entire planet. Again, these are animals that generally were living in a warm climate and then suddenly are plunged into an extended winter. Because of the reduction in sunlight, we also know that photosynthesis basically shut down. So we saw basically the entire collapse of like all plant-based food chains. And so, yeah, this is a really extreme, severe climate change event. In addition to all these other things that have happened. And so what we know from the End-Cretaceous extinction is that basically nothing over about 55 pounds survived. So large dinosaurs go extinct, larger mammals, the big flying reptiles called pterosaurs, marine reptiles like mosasaurs and plesiosaurs. Those animals just go completely extinct. And then even among animals that are alive today, like mammals and lizards, there's still a big reduction in the number of species that are around. So in total, there's probably about a 75% loss of all species on the planet. So, you know, life really did just kind of hang on by a thread after this particular event. So this is an example of a really abrupt climate change event. And is just a good example of how when climate changes too quickly, animals can't keep up. Evolution can't happen fast enough for things to adapt to those changing climates. And lots of things will go extinct, which is not a good thing. So let's go to a more recent event, well, more recent by about 10 million years, but it's relatively closer to us in time. And this is the opposite direction. This is a really hot period or a greenhouse event in Earth history with a sort of long name. It's called the Palaeocene-Eocene thermal maximum. That's our very technical term. And that basically just refers to the two geological eras it kind of occurs over. So the Paleocene and the Eocene are the sort of geological units following the end of the age of dinosaurs. So this isn't an area I directly study, but it's really interesting and important because we actually have a really extensive collection of Eocene fossils in our collection here that I'll show you towards the end of the presentation. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum is a super weird period of Earth history with at least one really hot pulse, and maybe actually it's several pulses of high temperatures. It's so warm that this is actually a picture of what Ellesmere Island in the Canadian high Arctic looked like at that time. So there are no ice caps, there are no glaciers anywhere. It is hot, 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 tropical everywhere on the planet, including the poles. This is, yeah, so we know there's been like fossils collected from the Canadian high Arctic. It's like tropical swamps. This is an extinct mammal called Coryphodon, but it's got a lifestyle kind of like a hippo. It's like sort of an early relative of all hoofed animals. We know that there's like turtles and crocodiles, all these animals that are restricted to warm environments today. So this is a really warm period in Earth history. And it's important because it serves as a model for what's happening to the planet today. And so it's actually a period of time that a lot of focus is on over the last 10 to 15 years, because there's a lot of parallels with what's happening with human-induced climate change. So starting about 56 million years ago, for still somewhat mysterious reasons, although there's a couple of different ideas out there for what the source of this warming is, about 2,000 gigatons of carbon gets released into the atmosphere, and carbon is kind of the main thing that causes global warming in the form of carbon dioxide. That carbon gets released over the period of about 20,000 years. To put that in context, we currently, humans, release about 10 gigatons of carbon per year. So it's actually not going to take us very long to catch up to this significant geological event that we see in the fossil record. This results in, depending on the model parameters, this results in 5 to 10 degrees of warming that lasts for about 200,000 years. So this is it's really important that we understand what that does to plants and animals in the fossil record, so that we have some idea of what's coming for us in the future. So what's interesting is that this really extreme warming event doesn't actually result in a mass extinction on the planet. It seems to cause some extinction of deep ocean animals, possibly because of ocean acidification, but we don't actually see like a mass extinction like we do with the asteroid impact at the end of the age of dinosaurs. There are big changes, however, to the planet. So instead of there being any kind of like Arctic ice caps or those kinds of faunas, you know, the ranges of tropical plants and tropical biomes expands, and different plants and animals are able to migrate into different parts of the planet, because you can basically walk from like Asia and Europe into North America across the Arctic. So we get really interesting changes in mammals and insects and plants. A really interesting thing that happens, though, is that mammals and also apparently insects become smaller during this interval. And that might be because plants actually become less nutritious as carbon dioxide levels increase. So one of the things that I've read is that a warmer world is potentially a hungrier world. And so mammals may have evolved smaller body sizes to cope with like less nutritious food. So there's still a lot that's being investigated about the impacts of this particular event and like what exactly it means for the evolution of life on Earth. But it's yeah, it's really interesting. It's super relevant and important for understanding what's happening today. So it's a pretty active field of study. And we're really lucky because actually British Columbia is one of the better places in North America to actually study the Eocene era and what exactly is happening here during some of these hot periods and then the subsequent cool downs. And so all of these different sites are places where you can find Eocene aged fossils in British Columbia. They're basically all ancient lakes that have then sort of become buried and turned into rock and then lifted back up to the surface. So like Driftwood Canyon Provincial Park, Maccabee by Kamloops, Horsefly River, all of these are their own sort of individual little lake deposits with fossils in them. We call them the Okanagan Highlands fossil localities. They're all kind of related, but all slightly unique and distinct as well. And so the fossils that you get from here are usually these kind of flat slabs of lake deposits. We call them lacustrine shales or lacustrine limestones. And they preserve really beautiful soft things. So we get really beautiful leaf impressions, insects, fish, all kinds of stuff. I'll show some pictures in a moment. And so we actually have examples of fossils from many of those localities I showed on the last slide. And in particular, we had a huge donation in 2018 of fossils by the Leahy and Langevin families. It represented about 18,000 fossils. So we're actually still working on like cataloging those and identifying them. And these are just some examples. So we've got things like ginkgos, 2 different types of ginkgos, lots of different broadleaf trees, lots of different conifers, things like dawn redwoods and cedars, all kinds of stuff like that. Many different species of fish, some really rare things like crayfish, which are really rare in the fossil record, and an absolutely astonishing array of insects, which don't have a good fossil record because they are squishy and usually disintegrate as soon as they hit the ground. And so, like I said, I don't directly study a lot of these, but I manage this collection and we have lots of people interested in studying it. We have people who come in and basically identify like 5 new insects every time they open a drawer and like find something interesting, people looking at the leaves and what that tells us about climate. Yeah, so this is basically, we can only really answer these questions using museum collections and fossils. So it's really important and something we should be really proud of having access to in the province. And one of the cool things that I just wanted to share is that if you went to Driftwood Canyon Provincial Park 52 million years ago, you would see this really different ecosystem that includes hedgehogs, really early relatives of hedgehogs, and tapirs, which is cool. So we have these examples of these fossils in our collection here. This is a tapir called Heptodon, and this is a hedgehog called Silvicola. And yeah, we can just learn such amazing things. And yeah, so definitely not like what we would see up in like sort of near Smithers and in that provincial park today. So I just wanted to end by talking about, you know, I'm showing you examples of natural climate change. So this is not human-induced climate change. Sometimes I see the argument that because climate change has happened in the past, it's natural and therefore not a big deal. I hope that what I have shown today is that natural does not necessarily mean good. And I think the dinosaurs would argue that climate change was bad. And even if we don't see mass extinctions as climate gets warmer in the Eocene, we certainly see the disappearance of habitats that we have today, like in the Arctic. And I would argue that, yeah, the fact that biomes are going to shift and change because of these increased temperatures is going to have a pretty big impact on humans and how we've built our society. So yeah, things can be natural, but still not necessarily good. And this is also not to say that human-induced climate change is not happening, because that's absolutely true. And that happens in addition to natural climate cycles as well. So yeah, thanks. I'll take questions at the end after our final presentation, but thanks for listening and coming out today. Great. Over to you.
You know, someone asked me the other night, with everything that's going on in the world with climate change, climate shift, and ecological disasters and so on, you know, why are we spending our time in museums collecting dead things? You know, what does it matter? So I wish they could have seen Victoria and Gavin's presentations, because, you know, collections, specimens and collections allow us to go back and see what has happened in order for us to understand what is happening today and how we can project that into the future. And biodiversity, you know, biodiversity is the strongest natural defense against climate change. Think of what you would do without plants, right? And so we need to understand what is living around us, what we do in order to deal with climate change. Now, what we do in invertebrate zoology is we look at specimens. Well, we look at biodiversity and we collect specimens to learn about what they are, how they live, how they are related to each other, what they do in the environment, and also what happens when you get shifts in movements of species. For example, what do you do when you have invasive species? And all that is not separate from our questions about climate change, what is happening around us. It's all it's great feedback system. And knowing about biodiversity is important for us to understand climate change and vice versa. So in biodiversity, the foundational unit of biodiversity research, the fundamental component of how we understand everything around us is understanding species. And that is what I do. I am a hydrozoan specialist, and hydrozoans are animals. They know that hydrozone, hydrozone looks like a plant, but it's an animal, and it's an animal related to corals and jellyfish. And hydrozones have a stage of life called a hydroid, and a hydroid is pretty special because hydroids generally like to live on different surfaces, whether they're other rocks or other surfaces or other animals, and so their importance is telling us what is happening in their immediate environment. And here's another example of hydroid from BC. So when we talk about climate change and how it affects biodiversity, we're really talking about shift in species distribution. And how do we look at that? Well, think about it as a broken thermostat in your house. Okay, so you're living in this house with different people. You have different rooms. Thermostat is broken. You cannot adjust the temperature. Sometimes it's too cold. Sometimes it's too hot. And what do? So the first response to changing climate is to shift locations. So species are not static. You know, you look at a tree outside your window and it's been there for 20 and 30 years, but plants are not static. Insects are not static, fish, and so on. Everything moves, and everything moves in response to its environment and different pressures. So the one other factor that we have in talking about climate change and shift in species is also the consequence of our own actions and our modifications to our environment. You know, you look at what's happening with relation to time. What we are doing is accelerating, in addition to causing some of what is happening with climate change, we are also accelerating what is happening within that. Okay, so for example, we move species around. The materials that we create move species around. So what I'm going to do next is just quickly touch on two stories that are related to what we're seeing with changes in our climate in a couple of areas where I've looked at hydroids before. The first is the Galapagos. Now, in the Galapagos, one of the reasons that the Galapagos is such a rich environment for unique biodiversity is because the Pacific equatorial undercurrent, which is an underwater, kind of an underwater highway, if you will. It brings nutrients eastwards to the Galapagos, and in normal years, the trade winds shift the warmer waters out west, and this is replaced by the nutrients from the upwelling, which then serves as a base for supporting biodiversity. Now, when this system is disrupted, when trade winds are either weaker or stronger, what you see are different responses in terrestrial and marine species. For example, survival and reproduction will be disrupted at different rates when the water temperature is warmer or when the water temperature is colder, right? And with what climate change does is that it also brings, in addition to more extreme weather events, it brings a greater variability. And you can see with greater variability, you have decreased survival and increased competition across all groups. So no one is happy when there's fluctuations in the system. On top of that, we have introduction of non-indigenous species to these environments. Okay, so you have your diversity that's already there, coping with these changes, and on top of that, you have introduction of species that are normally not there, and that again increases competition on top of all what's already happening. And in the Galapagos, for example, it's quite the changes are quite dramatic, as you can see before and after the Panama Canal. The increase in ship traffic is enormous, and what that does is that it increases the not only the number of potentially invasive species that are brought into that environment, but because then you have more activity and more people there, it also increases the shoreline infrastructure that is present there. Think of Victoria before and now. And along with increased infrastructure, critters like hydroids that I study can attach to more surfaces, and because people move around in their boats and so on, there are more opportunities for these hydroids to settle in different places and therefore be in direct competition with indigenous fauna. That is already there, already facing increased competition, already facing lower reproductive rates. And you have potentially invasive species. We call them non-indigenous species because we don't always know whether they are invasive or not. But we do know that they are potentially highly competitive and will have bad effects and could have adverse effects on fauna, which is already there. The second story is well related to how do species move around and how do species travel from one place to another. So I also had an opportunity to look at hydroids from the 2011 Japanese tsunami debris. Now, you might recall that this event was quite dramatic, and what it resulted in was a huge amount of human-made debris being jettisoned into the Pacific. And climate change will likely worsen the effects of these kinds of events. Now, the significance of this event was that for the first time, rafting is not a new phenomenon, and the paleontologists will tell you that this is likely the cause of how species are transported to different places. But we've never been able to observe this firsthand, but we were able to do this with the tsunami debris. And the big takeaway from this event was that not only could species survive, but entire shoreline communities were transported from one shore to another. So species from Japan ending up on the shores of North America. So entire species were transported. And the other part of this event that we look at is, where does the debris end up? Now this event happened in 2011, but its effects are still ongoing, and the debris is still being transported, and some of it has ended up in what we call the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is actually more than one garbage patch. And so the material is still out there. Some of it is still landing today. And some of it has ended up in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And we are also starting to see in this material the emergence of a new ecological community. In other words, that there are whole communities now that are a mixture of shoreline and shoreline fauna and animals from the high seas that are living on the debris in the ocean, either right on top of the surface of the water or right below it, floating on this material. So the story is ongoing, and I'd like to underscore that that biodiversity museums, biodiversity collections such as ours, okay, are foundational to understand these and other phenomena that are happening around us. So museum collections continue to be important and relevant. And museum collections review species relationships and distribution through time. That's the and if there's one thing you take away from today, think about that. That's why we're here. That's why we collect. We don't collect things just because they're pretty. We don't collect things because we have a compulsion to collect, although both may be correct. But we collect because they help us understand what's happening with climate change and what's happening around us. Thank you.